And at number 10, we have Azerite Essences. These were items that were obtained from patch 8.2 from almost all forms of content and would empower your Heart of Azeroth to grant you additional abilities and passives. All essences had levels 1 to 4, each increasing in power and giving additional passives, except for the last level, which was purely cosmetic. Now normally this wouldn't appear on a list like this, but after being reminded of where you got most of the essences, it felt best to start this list off with this one, since some of the essences you can get are from other grinds on this list. Meaning, if you wanted to be optimal in terms of power, you were required to do some of the other grinds that we're going to be talking about later on in this video. For example, to get the realistically most consistent dungeon damage dealer essence called Essence of the Focusing Iris, you had to do a +5 mythic dungeon for level 1, then a +7 mythic dungeon for level 2. Then suddenly, like a bolt from the blue, you were then required to wait until the end of the week to loot a resource from your weekly chest called Focus Life Anima, which only dropped 3 to 5 at a time, which you would then needed 15 of to fully acquire the last level of the essence. Or on the other end of the spectrum, to get one of the best essences in the game for every class and spec, called Blood of the Enemy, you're required to get a total of 30,000 honor and 60 total marks of honor to then purchase it, which isn't even including the cosmetic reward, which was 100,000 honor to acquire. There were of course also ones from the current raid when it was released called Condensed Life Force, which you were able to fully upgrade after acquiring 36 of a resource called Aqueous Reliquary, which only dropped from 3 bosses in the raid, 2 of which were 2 of the last 3 bosses of the raid, and they only dropped 3 to 5 at a time depending on the difficulty you did it for, forcing you to wait weeks for your DPS increase to come in and make the harder difficulties possible. Of course, this was also a pain for the race to world first at the time, making this easily number 10 on this list just for the sheer annoyance of having such an important power being time gated. And thanks to boot.dev for sponsoring today's video. Boot.dev is a website which teaches you coding, but does it in a fun way which gives you experience points for finishing lessons and achievements for hitting milestones. The main coding language is Python, which is used in the backend for a ton of different websites, and makes it easier to learn other coding languages too, since a lot of the concepts are the same. Earlier this year, I tried to learn how to code video games and had zero practical coding experience, so I wish I knew about boot.dev when I was looking online for coding tutorials and guides, because I found the best way to learn code was to just work on a small demo game following a guide, and BootDev has tons of small projects to work on to give you experience. And one of the amazing things about BootDev that I wish I had when I was learning it was its AI Bear Wizard, which is specifically trained in every lesson to help you complete the project. Because believe me, it's tough finding out how to debug your own projects. I even had to hire coding coaches online to come and call with me to go over my code, and you ain't got to worry about none of that with boot.dev. Support the channel by clicking my link and using the code HEROEX to get 25% off your first payment. Every subscription helps me create more awesome content for you. And at number 9, we have the Allied Races. These were added at the launch of BFA and were essentially extra unique and actually strong races that you could unlock after completing certain tasks and quests. There were 8 total, and each one had an associated quest line, and worse yet, a reputation grind, where you were required to reach Exalted with their associated faction. Normally, you'd think they'd be simple enough, especially with the advent of world quests, but it was actually extremely frustrating since of the new allied races, some were invaluable for grinding from then on. Take for example Volpera, which has an ability that lets them set a camp anywhere outside, whether it's outside of a raid or where a rare spawns, making going and killing the mob or doing the instance much less annoying when it came to the weekly or daily resets. But the worst part of it wasn't the reputation grind, it was what came after. At the time, the level cap was 120, and allied races would start at level 20, meaning you either had to drop $60 on a level boost for every character you now wanted as an allied race, or you had to level it by hand. For most mount collectors, or just collectors in general, it was a worthwhile investment, but it was a painfully grueling one, especially since each quest line to acquire the new allied race also granted you a race-specific mount, meaning if you wanted 8 free mounts, you needed 8 exalted reputations that you need to complete every quest in all 6 zones, just to get the mount portion that came with it. It was also just painfully annoying for most players, and most people chose to ignore it due to the main way to get rep at the time being world quests, which barely rewarded between 50 to 150 rep per world quest at the time. This was until Blizzard did eventually increase the amount of points you gained towards the necessary reputations, but at the time it was just simply too annoying for most players. And at number 8, we have the Honeyback Harvester. This was a new reputation grind that was released in patch 8.2.5, where you were able to collect jelly across the Stormsong Valley and turn it into a special NPC for an amount of reputation, which would eventually give you the Honeyback Harvester mount for free at Exalted. As far as reputation grinds go, this is actually fairly easy compared to the previous mention on this list. But where the real problem arises was when this was current, the nodes were like mining or herbalism nodes, meaning if you didn't loot the same spot within a certain time frame of someone else, it would disappear and you would get 0 loot. Adding on to the fact that before you could even start the questline to unlock the reputation, you needed a certain amount of Stormsong Valley rep reputation to buy a specific pet, named the Seabreeze Bumblebee, or an achievement called Bumbles, who had their own week-long time-gated grind acquired, which would finally let you talk to a B reputation vendor, made this extremely irritating to grind out right from the start. However, the most annoying part of this grind was probably also the fact that you got 3 different types of jelly. An uncommon, rare, and epic version, each giving you subsequently more and more reputation, where the most common one gave you a measly 20 reputation and was actually 20 times more common than the epic version. Getting to Exalted would have taken quite literally 2100 of the common jellies. And even going into war mode to have less people around to get more jelly didn't help either, since it was alliance only, giving Horde easy ways to farm people by camping the spawn locations, which ended up corralling all of the players out of war mode and making the grind excruciatingly long. Lastly, you were able to trade and buy and sell the jellies from the auction house, but the prices were extremely high due to the popularity of the mount, making this a quick cash grab for those players who completed it already and just wanted to steal jelly from others, causing players to once again get in their own way for profit. If this wasn't the only B mount in the game from that point onwards until the War Within dropped earlier this year, then it probably wouldn't be so sought after. But that's why it ended up at number 8 on our list. And at number 7, we have the dungeon mounts. During BFA, there were a total of 5 dungeons that were able to drop mounts and could be farmed and grinded out via Mythic Plus, those being the Underrot Crag, Tombstalker, Mecha Mogul MK2, Mechagon Peacekeeper, and the infamous Sharkbait. Normally, if Blizzard released a drop chance mount, it would be very easy to get, especially in Shadowlands where they did something similar, bringing back older Mythic Plus dungeons to even be able to farm them again. The issue, however, ended up being that they had cut the drop chance in half for every single one of the dungeon mounts from BFA, except for the Mecha Mogul MK2, which was because that one was a crafted mount that ended up costing well over 30,000 gold in materials. Meaning these mounts went from reasonably farmable within a week or two to literally some of the rarest mounts in the game, some of which were still not obtained when they brought back some of the dungeons like Freehold or Underrot. Freehold especially became notorious for the place where Sharkbait would never drop from, even after several hundreds of runs in Mythic Plus and regular Mythic. Since it was quite an easy dungeon in both BFA and Dragonflight, it made it all the more exhausting when after the 30th run of the week, it wouldn't drop. I myself have over 284 attempts at it and still have never seen it drop for me or anyone else of my regular teammates. That, and the Mechagon Peacekeeper, which I only have 139 attempts on. Lastly, to add insult to injury, Blizzard did end up making the Dungeon Mount in Shadowlands, Marrowfang, twice as likely to drop, meaning people spent all that time grinding one of those dungeon mounts in BFA and never got them, only to spend under 20 attempts and receive this new one, leaving quite the bitter taste in their mouth. And at number 6, we have Island Expeditions. These were bonus group content that was run with 2 other players, where you would enter a race either against other players or against NPCs to gather as much Azerite as possible on the island that you ended up on. Sounds simple enough, you just queue with some friends and hammer them out in a day, right? Well, not quite. As it was discovered rather quickly, the island expeditions were extremely, boring. Due to the lack of, any real challenge, players would hammer these out in troves before burning out in less than a week, and barely any loot to their name due to it. And on top of the fact that players did discover that certain islands only spawned certain enemy types, which had a chance of dropping different loot, and the fact that these islands rotated weekly, meant if you didn't get the drop you were looking for that week, there was a good chance you wouldn't see it again for upwards of 4 weeks if the rotation was bad. Even then, of course, Blizzard wouldn't make it that easy of a waiting game. You also had to actually get the enemies to spawn, which was purely RNG, not on rotation. So you could potentially, if you were unlucky, go dozens of island expeditions not getting the right island or enemies to spawn to get a chance at the specific mount or pet that you wanted dropping. Oh, speaking of, there weren't just normal mounts, there were pets, rare transmog items like the Plundered Blade of Northern Kings, which is one of those unique weapon transmogs only obtainable in island expeditions, all of which you could obtain multiple times, meaning when you received one, you even had a chance of getting the same drop in a row instead of something else. Blizzard also had added a vendor to the unexpedition area to trade currency called Seafarer's Doubloons, which could drop from as low as 5 to upwards of 60, which you could use to purchase a chance at a rare drop from a certain enemy type, or save up for the Seawater Seahorse or Slitwing Albatross mount, which sold for 500 and 1000 of the currency respectively, just to put more grind into this already painful process. And of course, as if to make our lives even worse, Blizzard made islands and enemy specific achievements that you would also have to wait weeks on end for them to rotate through just to attempt at, making this grind absolutely grueling for you and your friends to go through. And at number 5, we have the Visions of N'Zoth. These were bonus instances that you could run solo, where you would battle through nightmarish versions of your capital cities of Orgrimmar or Stormwind, and attempt to subdue the nightmares and acquire loot. These were, of course, as the description implies, nightmares to complete. Due to the fact that they were weekly time-gated and required you to level up your legendary cloak, it made the process of even reaching the endgame level of Visions of N'Zoth unnecessarily annoying. But adding on to it, there were also extra bosses and special enemies you could find in each capital city, which rotated weekly and each had a chance to drop special loot if you could find them. Certain pets that only drop from the hardest enemies to fight, like Magister Umbric in Stormwind or Rexxar in Orgrimmar, which required absolute focus or they would kill you and you would have to restart the entire attempt at defeating the Vision and them. Oh, and did I mention, during this entire ordeal, you are timed. Your legendary cloak and the console within the Chamber of the Heart, which would allow you to unlock the upgrades, made it slowly easier and easier to stay in the Vision longer without going insane. If you ever did go insane, you'd be forcibly removed and forced to start over, meaning you needed perfect execution from start to finish in order to even complete them, let alone to find the rare enemies. Speaking of rare enemies, it couldn't be that easy, of course, since there was a special rare mob called the Mail Muncher, which was a 1 in 100 chance of spawning whenever you looted a mailbox in the Visions of N'Zoth. These mailboxes had the same spawn areas, but the real issue was getting to them without going insane, since most of them were in areas that required a lot of upgrades to reach. And even then, you had to kill the thing at the very end, potentially dying due to insanity or just the damage the rare can output for even a chance of it dropping its mount. Blizzard really did make these things feel like nightmares, so props to them for being lore accurate. And at number 4, we have Mollie. Mollie was a rare drop alpaca mount, one of the only 3 in the game since BFA, which had a rare chance of dropping from the world boss Dungeon Gorger Krolok. Now, this entry on this list is probably going to be short and sweet. At the time of world bosses being active in BFA, there were a staggering 6 of them in rotation when Dungeon Gorger Krolok was released, meaning that every 6 weeks he would be killable for a chance of the mount once a week for the entire week, meaning you had to wait an entire month and a half for you to be able to get a chance of it dropping again. And unfortunately, to add even more pain onto it, you could only have a chance to receive the loot when the world quest for the world boss was active, meaning if you somehow didn't complete the world quest, it was not possible to receive the loot from it, which was an extremely common problem that has persisted since Legion and their new advent of multiple world bosses on a rotation, and unfortunately hasn't really been fixed since then. This problem also somewhat persists to this day, but luckily Blizzard did end up putting Dungeon Gorger Krolok out of rotation and have it spawn just like their world bosses from Mists of Pandaria, making it much less irritating to farm. But at the time, it was a very painful experience waiting months and months and never seeing a drop even for any of your friends as well, since you probably had only attempted 7 or 8 times before the next patch even rolled around. And at number 3, we have Corruption and Corrupted Gear. Corruption was a mechanic added in patch 8.3 which gave any piece of gear a chance of being corrupted, giving it extra stats or an extra effect at the cost of gaining the corruption stat and debuffs. In stark contrast to the last entry, there's a lot to explain here, so buckle up for a moment. Back in patch 7.0.3 of Legion, Blizzard added a mechanic called Titan Forging. It was universally known as the worst best mechanic in the game because it gave any gear you received a chance to be upwards of 30 item levels higher than the previous possible item levels, meaning a Titan Forged piece from normal mode could be as good as a mythic piece, and a mythic Titan Forged piece was the best piece in the game. It was universally hated since it essentially put RNG in your RNG, since the piece you wanted had to drop and then had a slight chance of Titan Forging. It was eventually removed, but in BFA, Corruption was added as a second try of the mechanic, where the stat increases were entirely separate from the item level of the item, and there was a downside. Now, that's all well and good, but there were several problems with it. First of all, being that it was entirely random, meaning you can go multiple hours of farming one dungeon for one drop and only see the item you need drop one time, and have it not be corrupted. Or worse yet, the item has corruption, but it has the wrong one, making corruption an extremely annoying and downright toxic mechanic to work with for several months. Add on top of the fact that your legendary cloak was required for a corruption downside to quite literally not kill you whenever you entered combat. It added another time-gated mechanic to an already stupid and dumb way to get extra borrowed power. Blizzard did eventually implement a band-aid fix midway through May, which was a vendor that lets you buy corruptions from the resources that you got from a raid or world content and apply it to gear. However, it was around 4 months after the patch had dropped, making the patch probably one of the worst parts of the expansion until the vendor was added. But luckily the vendor was added at all compared to the next 2 mentions on this list. Starting with, at number 2, we have Benthic Gear. Benthic Gear was added at the beginning of patch 8.2 and was a brand new gear that was obtainable from most content in the new zone of Nazjatar, and gave extra bonuses for being in Nazjatar as well as the new raid that was added in the patch. These bonuses range from a proc to increase secondary stats, a damage proc, all the way to a flat damage type reductions and increases to certain enemies, or even getting more health back from being resurrected in combat, making them quite necessary for any form of endgame raiding, or simply doing the hardest parts of the world content at the time. Unfortunately, Blizzard couldn't make it that easy, as Blizzard at the time had released their first upgrade vendor as well, which lets you increase the item level of these items from worse than leveling gear all the way to the same as heroic level pieces. And of course, they also had to give it a unique currency called prismatic mana pearls. And of course, they had to make gathering said currency the most painful process imaginable, which was doing world content. That of course also reset weekly or daily. It would be fine if it was between 20 and 40 of the prismatic mana pearls to upgrade a piece, but of course they had to make that miserable as well, making the price exponential, starting out from 10 and going all the way up to 100. And did I mention that the enemies or chests that drop these prismatic mana pearls also drop between 7 and 20 of them, meaning you had to do upwards of 10 pieces of world content to get barely enough to upgrade an item halfway. And to add a cherry on top of these excessive and painful grinds, all the best pieces at the time were Azerite pieces, which had their own prices that were far and away the most expensive. Starting out at a measly 50, it proceeded to skyrocket all the way to 350 mana pearls for a total of 400 for one item, and you had to get 3 of them. There's a big reason Nazjatar is a lot of players' least favorite zone, and I believe it largely had to do with the Benthic Gear. But even that isn't as painful as the number 1 option on this list, since it only lasted a patch long. And at number 1, we have Azerite Armor. This was special armor added in BFA that was available for your helmet, shoulder, and chest pieces, which had added effects that gained power along with your Heart of Azeroth in exchange for no secondary stats. This was the worst system and gear ever added for Battle for Azeroth, and in the game in general, there has never been anything worse than it. And it's just a testament to how horrible this grind in order to get Azerite Armor was. That was because, to put it plainly, you had to wait once a week for a chance to get a piece that was actually usable. And it was around 1 in 100 chance depending on the class and spec, since the only way to actually get a good piece of Azerite Armor that wasn't from a raid was from your weekly chest for doing Mythic Plus. Blizzard thought that having Azerite Armor not dropping from Mythic Plus was perfectly okay, and ended up being one of their worst mistakes in the game's history. It would have been fine if the pieces that dropped potentially from raid were good, but Blizzard also made them routinely the worst in the game except for the last 3 bosses on Mythic difficulty based purely on item level. Meaning you would have to wait until the end of the week every Tuesday and pray for a piece from your weekly chest to be anything decent from the day 1 of the expansion. From my own experience, I ended up not replacing the same pieces I had from the beginning of patch 8.2.5 all the way to the end of the expansion, which included another raid tier, simply because I'd never got a single upgrade for them. If Blizzard had implemented a fix or better system, it probably would have been lower on this list. But because it only got fixed by being removed when the expansion was over, is why it's the worst grind in BFA. Alright, and that's the list. If you agree or disagree with anything on our list, I'd love to hear about what you think in the comments down below, especially if you thought any other grind was worse. Be sure to also check out the other videos on this channel, like the top 10 worst grinds in Shadowlands, for example. Go to boot.dev and use my code RumorRedX to get 25% off your first month, or even your first entire year if you choose the annual plan.